Hi. I was tagged in a post asking to read my favorite passage from my favorite Harry Potter book in my favorite cosplay or as my favorite character. Um, That's a lot of favorites. But I've never cosplayed Remus before, even though this blog was intended for me to be cosplay Remus blog. Um, but yeah, this is post-war, post-Hogwarts Remus Lupin when I'm running around with other werewolves for Dumbledore to spy. So, yeah. This is my favorite book, Order of the Phoenix, because it's the first of the Harry Potter books that I coherently understood, and the one that made me feel the most. There's a lot of raw emotion in this one that spoke to me and spoke about. It made me think about life a lot more. And I felt more identified with Remus in this book than I did any other. That being said, I'm going to read my favorite passage in it, which is basically just a human conversation. Or human conversations. Of course they're human. Most of them are humans. A family conversation. It's family I was always envious that I wish I had. So, here we go. Starting at page 87, when they are all at Grimmauld Place, and Harry had just arrived at the noble House of Black. "Nearly time for bed, I think," said Mrs. Weasley on a yawn. "Not just yet, Molly," said Sirius, pushing away his empty plate and turning to look at Harry. "You know, I'm surprised at you. I thought the first thing you'd do when you got here was start asking questions about Voldemort." The atmosphere in the room changed with the rapidity Harry associated with the arrival of the Dementors. Where seconds before it had been sleepily relaxed, it was now alert, even tense. A frisson had gone around the table at the mention of Voldemort's name. Lupin, who had been about to take a sip of wine, lowered his goblet slowly, looking wary. "I did," said Harry indignantly. "I asked Ron and Hermione, but they said they weren't allowed in the Order, so—" "And they're quite right," said Mrs. Weasley. "You're too young." She was sitting bolt upright in her chair, her fist clenched upon its arms, every trace of drowsiness gone. "Since when did someone have to be in the Order of the Phoenix to ask questions?" asked Sirius. "Harry's been trapped in that Muggle house for a month. He's got every right to know what's been happened." "Hang on," interrupted George loudly. "How come Harry gets his questions answered?" said Fred angrily. "We've been trying to get stuff out of you for a month, and you haven't told us a single stinking thing," said George. "You're too young. You're not in the Order," said Fred in a high-pitched voice that sounded uncannily like his mother's. "Harry's not even of age." "It's not my fault you haven't been told what the Order's doing," said Sirius calmly. "If that's your parents' decision. Harry, on the other hand—" "It's not down to you to decide what's good for Harry," said Mrs. Weasley sharply. Her normally kind face looked dangerous. "You haven't forgotten what Dumbledore said, I suppose." "Which bit?" Sirius asked politely, but the air was already tightening around itself for a fight. "The bit about not telling Harry more than he needs to know," said Mrs. Weasley, placing a heavy emphasis on the last three words. Ron, Hermione, Fred, and George's head turned from Sirius to Mrs. Weasley as though following a tennis rally. Ginny was kneeling amid a pile of abandoned butterbeer corks, watching the conversation with her mouth slightly open. Lupin's eyes were fixed on Sirius. "I don't intend to tell him more than he needs to know, Molly," said Sirius. "But as he was the one who saw Voldemort come back," again there was a collective shudder around the table at the name, "he has more right than most to—" "He's not a member of the Order of the Phoenix," said Mrs. Weasley. "He's only 15, and he's dealt with as much as most of the Order," said Sirius. "And more than some." No one is denying what he's done, said Mrs. Weasley, her voice rising, her fist trembling on the arms of the chair. But he's not a child, said Sirius impatiently. He's not an adult, either, said Mrs. Weasley, the color rising in her cheeks. He's not James, Sirius. I'm perfectly clear who he is, thanks, Molly, said Sirius coldly. I'm not sure you are, said Mrs. Weasley. Sometimes the way you talk about him, it's as though you think you've got your best friend back. And what's wrong with that? Said Harry. What's wrong, Harry, is that you are not your father, however much you might look like him, said Mrs. Weasley, her eyes still boring into Sirius. You are still at school, and adults responsible for you should not forget it. Meaning I'm an irresponsible godfather? Demanded Sirius, his voice rising. Meaning you've known how to act rashly, Sirius, which is why Dumbledore keeps reminding you to stay at home and... We'll leave my instructions from Dumbledore out of this, if you please, said Sirius loudly. Arthur, said Mrs. Weasley, rounding on her husband. Arthur, back me up. Mr. Weasley did not speak at once. He took off his glasses and cleaned them slowly on his robes, not looking at his wife. Only when he had placed them carefully on his nose did he say, Dumbledore knows the position has changed, Molly. He accepts that Harry will have to be filled in to a certain extent now that he is staying in the headquarters. Yes, but there's a difference between that and inviting him to ask whatever he likes. Personally, said Lupin quietly, looking away from Sirius at last. As Mrs. Weasley turned quickly on him, hopeful that finally she was about to get an ally. I think it's better that Harry gets the facts. Not all the facts, Molly, but the general picture. From us, rather than some garbled version from others. His expression was mild, but Harry felt sure that Lupin at least knew that some extendable ears had survived Mrs. Weasley's purge. Well, said Mrs. Weasley, breathing deeply and looking around the table for support that did not come. Well, I can see I'm going to be overruled. I'll just say this. Dumbledore must have had his reasons for not wanting Harry to know too much, and speaking as someone who's got Harry's best interests at heart, he's not your son, said Sirius quietly. He's as good as, said Mrs. Weasley fiercely. Who else has he got? He's got me. Yes, said Mrs. Weasley, her lip curling. The thing is, it's been rather difficult for you to look after him while you've been locked up in Azkaban, hasn't it? Sirius started to rise from his chair. Molly, you're not the only person at this table who cares about Harry, said Lupin sharply. Sirius, sit down! Mrs. Weasley's lower lip was trembling. Sirius sank back into his chair, his face white. I think Harry ought to be allowed to have a say in this, Lupin continued. He's old enough to decide for himself. I want to know what's been going on, Harry said at once. He did not look at Mrs. Weasley. He had been touched by what she had said about being as good as his son. But he was also impatient at her mollycoddling. Sirius was right. He was not a child. That's it. Even though it was a family argument, it was one of my favorite passages because it was the first time I felt like Harry was starting to have a normal life. The first time I felt like he was having, not family, but the first time it started feeling whole. Everybody was fighting over what was best for him. And everyone was talking about how he's not a child, but he's not an adult either. He's in that medium that everybody goes through. That teenage stage where you want to do adult things, but the responsibility would be too hard on you. So the other adults around you try to protect you from that. Let you live as a child a little longer. It was also one of the best chapters to me because I had several adults that felt like I was their kid as well. And they helped raise me a lot. So it's a little glimpse into my life. Thanks for watching.